So, you've decided to start making music and you've seen these little guys around. You thought, oh, I might get myself one of these keyboards and start making some music. But you may not have realized that this is no different than this. You can't play games on this Xbox controller, and you can't make beats on this MIDI controller all by itself. You're gonna need a computer, and maybe you already knew that and you're down with that, but in reality, you might want a device that is purely standalone that you can just sit down and make some music away from a computer, away from another electronic device. And to demonstrate what a typical Groovebox is, I'm gonna use this SEQTRAK because it's kind of the most basic example. What we have here is a device that can play different synth sounds that we can also use for some sample-based drums. And with this device, we can also sequence those sounds and start creating like an actual song. And we can do things like tweak the actual sounds that we have. And there's even some effects built in that allow us to really be self-contained in writing music in a single box. That is the magic of a Groovebox, and let's stick with the SEQTRAK so we can start to talk about some of the most important aspects that you need to know when choosing which Groovebox is right for you. We've got a lot of chaos going on here on the desk, so don't worry, we're going to show off lots of different devices today. Definitely not all the devices, but lots of different devices. I did mention earlier that the SEQTRAK has some sample capability, but let's forget that for now. I would classify the SEQTRAK as mostly a synth-based Groovebox. That basically means that under the hood there is a synth engine, which gives us the sound that we're hearing now, which can be tweaked right from the device, and you can even do some sound design on the computer. And of course, synth-based Grooveboxes come with generally a bunch of presets utilizing their sound engine. But not all synth engines sound the same. For instance, if we swap out the SEQTRAK and bring in another Groovebox here, this one is by Elektron. It's called the Model Cycles. This utilizes a type of synthesis called FM synthesis. Let's give it a listen. I'm going to mute everything but like the typical synth sounds here. And actually all the sounds in this box are created utilizing FM synthesis. Compare this to these synth sounds from the Yamaha SEQTRAK. And these sounds from Ableton Move. All of those sound pretty different, and a well-trained sound designer might be able to get them all to sound similar, but different synth types can drastically impact the kind of sound you're going to get out of a Groovebox. And that brings us to our first checklist item. How does the synth engine sound? Do you see people making the kind of music you want to make, making the kind of sounds you want to make with that particular Groovebox? You can of course read up and educate yourself on all the different synth types and different sound design techniques, but I'm assuming as a beginner you want to jump right into the music making process. So make things easier on yourself and choose a Groovebox with a synth sound that inspires you and fits the type of music you want to be making. Now, I did mention earlier that the SEQTRAK, in addition to its synth engine, has some sample-based stuff going on with it with these drum sounds, and this is an important distinction to make. Whereas synths are built on an engine that can be tweaked and designed, samples are purely based on audio, like a literal recorded audio file. But not all machines utilize samples the same way. So for instance, on the SEQTRAK, we have very basic sample capabilities in that we can do basic things like manipulate samples, change their pitch, maybe shorten them, distort them, add effects to them, all those kinds of things. But we're really just meant to take short little samples and sequence them on the grid, which will get us drum patterns like these. Just like very simple little samples, sample them on the grid, mostly used for drum purposes. But let me introduce you to a well-beloved device that maybe you've seen before. This is the SP404MK2. Now here's where the lines get a bit fuzzy of what's a Groovebox, what's not a Groovebox, because I think most people would say the Roland SP404MK2 is a sampler. And while yes, that's true, we can take those samples and sequence them and make full beats with this thing. But the main difference between a machine that is only sample based and a more synth based machine is that there's no synth engine on this thing. We can only work with audio, which fundamentally changes how you write music. All of these little sounds were sampled into the machine from other sources. Like, I didn't just generate these sounds from the machine. Now, what I did do is manipulate these samples on the machine and make them sound different than when they were first recorded, giving them a very distinct sound, and that ultimately results in something that sounds like this. It's all audio. I'm not playing individual notes, we've just been sampling. That's similar in workflow to a device that might look a bit familiar. This is the circuit rhythm, which of course looks pretty close to our circuit tracks. The difference being here is that the circuit rhythm, no synth engines, it's entirely sample based, which that gets us a sound like this. It's a lot of fun, but again, we're not taking like a synth and writing those musical ideas per se. We're using audio, manipulating it in a way that gets us to where we want to go. Can you take a single note of an instrument and play it like its own synth? Yes, but there are drawbacks to that. The sample has to stretch and shrink depending on how high or how low the note is. It's not going to sound the same as using an actual synth engine. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just means you're going to get a particular sound from a strictly sample-based workflow and a workflow that sort of either is synth-based or combines synths and samples. So that brings us to another checklist item, sampling. Is the music you want to make largely built on samples? Do you want to go deep in crafting your own sound with samples, manipulating audio in that way? Or are you okay with just some basic sample functionality, sequencing some short samples on a grid like you would with the drum functionality of the circuit tracks? It all comes down to what extent you want to be utilizing samples. And while I have these two sample-based machines in front of me, we need to talk about like usability, limitations, and workflow. But as music makers yourself out there, you might be wondering, how am I going to get my music out on all the streaming services, get it out to the world? You can do that with the distributor I've been using since way before they ever sponsored the channel, DistroKid. DistroKid's motto is be prolific, which is why I signed up for them in the first place. You just pay one annual fee and upload as much music as you want throughout the year. Of course, that gets your music to all the places it needs to go, but there's a lot of other features for DistroKid artists, including making a hyperfollow page to link to all the places where your music is, and also maybe you made a music video, you can put a link to that there as well, and things like promo cards where you just get easy graphics to promote your release, as well as a Spotify canvas generator, which allows you to choose from a bunch of stock video that best fits your track and just takes another load off your shoulders. As an artist, you want to mostly focus on the music, and all of the bonus features that come with your DistroKid account really help to do that. So use my link in the description, you can get 7% off your first year. Like I said before, I have been releasing music with DistroKid since well before they ever sponsored this channel. I've never had any issues. Literally my first TAETRO release was released via DistroKid. So I hope on your music making journey, if you're looking to get your music out there, you will choose DistroKid as well. 7% off when you support the sponsor, you support the channel. Now let's get back into talking about Grooveboxes. All right, before we get into some of the bigger machines, while I have the Circuit Rhythm and the SP404MK2 here, both sample-based Grooveboxes, I really want to talk about workflow, limitations, and sequencing. On the Circuit Rhythm here, I literally just select a track, that's a kick drum, I put those notes onto a grid, I press play, and suddenly I can keep building on that. This is a very easy workflow, right? Like, that was very fast, that was very intuitive. When I press play, even though this device doesn't have a screen, I can basically tell what's happening. The SP404, on the other hand, look, this is a very deep device with a lot of other use cases besides just purely being a Groovebox. Like I said, it's a sampler first and foremost. But it does also have a pattern mode, which is how I was able to craft this track. But I can tell you from experience that it's not nearly that same fast workflow as I just demonstrated here on the Circuit Rhythm. It doesn't mean one is better than the other, and if I compared the workflow and the sequencing on all the devices in front of me, we would have lots of nuances to say this one is better at this and that one is better at that. The point is that all of these boxes have their own nuances and limitations, and some of those particularly pertain to sequencing, the actual writing and recording of the music on the boxes. Ableton Move, for example, the max pattern size you can get is 16 bars, and we don't really get any advanced sampling features like probability or mutate, something like the Circuit Rhythm has. And the Circuit Rhythm's max sample time is 32 seconds, I believe, whereas on the Roland SP404MK2, you can have samples as long as 16 minutes. That definitely impacts how you build sequences and what type of sequences you can build. So any device can be learned. You can spend a lot of time with the manual and become the expert on any one of these devices, but some of these devices are just easier to jump into. So I guess my next checklist item is about sequencing, but also about limitations and usability. Just understand the limitations in the actual workflow of the box that you're planning to get. Are you looking to write full songs or just some sketches? Are you looking for a Groovebox that'll mostly be used for performance or only for production? These are all questions you should ask yourself and compare the pros and cons of the devices you're looking at. All right, we gotta make some room here. You go here, get out of the way, get out of the way. Celebrities coming through, make room, make room. All right, the two devices you see in front of me are obviously much larger than the previous devices we featured. And in a lot of ways, these devices go beyond just the typical Groovebox. I would say these devices are more like full-on DAWs in a box, meaning they're very much similar to the experience of loading up a program on your computer and making music in that way, except they're just like self-contained in boxes. Now, of course, I will include the caveat in this particular instance, whereas we can work on a full timeline here on the MPC, there's still no like arrangement or timeline functionality on the Push 3. However, this is basically running Ableton Live inside this box, other than that missing arrangement view aspect. These are very powerful boxes that go above and beyond the boxes we looked at earlier. MPC One, for instance, here, I can do sample-based stuff. They've also got a bunch of synths. They've also recently partnered with Native Instruments to bring Native Instruments sounds to this box. It's just crazy what they've got going on here. On the other hand, I've got Ableton Push 3, which is like very much in my realm as an Ableton Live user. Being able to have this standalone machine with a workflow as great as Ableton Live, it really goes a long way for me. I'm not sure if I would recommend it 100% for beginners, since I would recommend having a bit of Ableton Live knowledge before jumping in with this one. But the main point here is to just get you to understand that there are versions of these machines that come very close to being like the computer experience. I mean, if you look at this touchscreen that we have here on MPC One, it becomes just like a tablet touchscreen kind of thing. And that is good if you want to be super extensive and work like that in a box. However, it's completely different than like a screenless machine with more limitations. So I guess my checklist item here is to align your expectations. If you are using a device that has no screen and has a limited number of tracks or whatever limitations it has, it's going to be totally different than using these kind of much more expensive devices that more mimic the DAW experience. But they are out there and you can get that experience in these standalone boxes. And now for the total opposite end of the spectrum, here is a device you'll all recognize, my iPhone. You probably have a smartphone, whether it's Android or Apple. It is very capable of running some great apps that make music. This is Koala Sampler, for example, an app that very much mimics the workflow of an SP404MK2, and you can make full-on beats with this thing. It was mostly a sample-based app until they went ahead and added a synth engine to it. So it's a Groovebox as an app on your phone. Ableton Note is an app that can be used completely on its own that gives you the Ableton kind of session view workflow with, again, synth-based and sample-based workflow. BandLab is a totally free app with, again, sample-based, synth-based workflow. Can work on a timeline. It's really simple, but it's really easy to start writing songs on a free app. Now, we had mentioned MIDI controllers at the beginning of today's video, and the funny thing is, if you get one of these boxes, you can control it with a MIDI controller potentially. But remember, the MIDI controller is just that, it's a controller. And if you want to be making music in a self-contained device, no computer, these are all great options. Which one do you want? Can I give you this one? Can I give you this one? So I hope now you've got a clear checklist so that you can understand what features are most important to you in a Groovebox. Remember, you are not looking for the perfect device. You are looking for the device that checks most of your boxes. And that might be multiple devices, so don't get stuck. Pick the device based on your knowledge and just start making music. This has been TAETRO. Link in the description for DistroKid. Save 7%. Have a good one.